welcome back to my channel. My name's Michelle, and around here we talk about 18th century women's history and what it's like to be a rookie novelist. I was recently reading through the travel diaries of one of the ancillary characters in my book, and I was struck by how uncomfortable and how dangerous travel was for him. He didn't seem too bothered by it, but it made me think, if it was dangerous and uncomfortable for men, imagine the precarity for women. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Women in 18th century British North America traveled for a lot of the same reasons that we do today. Both elite and non-elite women would travel for social occasions, although for working class women, they tended to stick closer to home, in part because they had work to do, but also because of their financial insecurity. In 1704, Sarah Kemble Knight traveled for business. Her cousin had just died, and she traveled from Boston to New Haven, Connecticut to help his widow settle his estate. And then in 1748, Elizabeth Jones, she took the furthest trip. She left British North America to go over to England to spend a couple of years in Bath for her health. Her husband during those 2 years helped manage things for her, sending money to a colleague who was over there to help her and making sure that logistics like her luggage and things were all taken care of. Often travelers in British North America would be using post roads. They'd be traveling by horseback or carriage, and they would be led by a post carrier as their guide. Now, keep in mind, these roads weren't really roads as we know. Some of them were barely footpaths that they would be trying to travel over, and they didn't have much protection from things like the weather or thieves on the road. So it was a very dangerous and precarious pursuit to travel amongst the colonies. Now, our woman Sarah Kemble Knight, who kept a fantastic diary of her travels, had something to say about this, and I'm actually going to read straight from her travel diary. She says, in this case, she's talking about traveling on those post roads and her guide. She says, "Here we found great difficulty in traveling, the way being very narrow, and on each side the tree and bushes gave us very unpleasant welcomes with their branches and boughs, which we could not avoid, it being so exceeding dark. My guide, as before so now, put on harder than my weary bones could follow, so left me the way behind him." Great. In addition to having a rough trip on the roads, lodging could also be pretty rough, and you never really knew if you were going to get a decent bed to sleep in or a decent meal. And after a long time on those narrow footpaths, Sarah Kemble Knight was ready for a decent meal. Unfortunately, that's not what she got. And again, I'm going to read from her journal because it's fascinating. She says, "Landlady came in with her hair about her ears and hands full pay scratching," right? "She told us she had some mutton which she would broil, which I was glad to hear, but I suppose forgot to wash her scratchers. In a little time she brought it in, but it being pickled, and my guide said it smelled strong of head sauce, we left it and paid 6 pence for a piece of our dinners, which was only smell." So yeah, not a whole lot of food safety going on when traveling in 18th century British North America. And I would be pretty upset if I had been traveling in such rough conditions and couldn't even get a decent dinner. women traveling in the colonies in the 18th century often stayed pretty close to home. And they did this because then they could stay with friends and family throughout their travels, probably have a more comfortable experience. But sometimes women did have to stay in inns and taverns as they were traveling, and they could never be guaranteed that they wouldn't run into some unsavory characters, or that the inns and taverns would be clean and offer proper services, as we saw with the landlady that Sarah Kemble Knight encountered and the mutton that was inedible. And in fact, William Byrd II was traveling. I'm going to read from his travel diary. His experience at an inn and the cleanliness thereof was this: there was not more than one bed to pig into, with one cotton sheet and the other of brown Ozenbrug, made browner by months of perspirations. Ugh. But the thing is, with these inns and taverns, tavern keepers were really trying to get as many people as they could into their rooms and into the beds that they had, which brings up the term pigging in. That was when you had more than one person sharing a bed. And yes, they could be strangers, so particularly uncomfortable for a woman, right? And money really mattered. Charlotte Brown was traveling throughout the colonies on her own, and she was making arrangements at taverns to have a bed to herself. However, what she found is that if men showed up with actual cash, any agreement that she had made with the tavern keeper would pretty much get thrown out the window, and she would find herself without a bed. There were also some rules around conduct in inns and taverns that were designed to help protect patrons, but didn't always work. So now some of these terms of conduct were: you weren't supposed to kiss the landlady. So sexual assault on women, not really a thing that was approved of. Also drinking too much, didn't want to be drinking too much. And keep in mind that these regulations were aimed primarily at men. Women were being protected by these regulations, or at least that was supposed to be the case. But listen to this, because this isn't a situation that a woman tavern keeper found herself in. When a man attempted to ravish both a servant woman and their landlady, who defended herself with a chamber pot charged to the brim with female ammunition. So a little bit on the financial implications of travel when we talked about Charlotte Brown and her experiences in the 1750s. However, there was also a societal cost to travel for women. And elite women handled this by staying close to home, as we discussed before. That way they could make sure that they were within their own class, so to speak. And if they knew they were going to be in male-dominated areas like taverns and inns, they often made sure that they were accompanied by a family member or a chaperone of some sort to protect their reputation. Now, non-elite women didn't necessarily have to abide by these protocols, so they traveled by themselves a little bit more, and they may have found themselves in male-dominated spaces more than elite white women. However, it was also these solo travelers, Black women and Native American women, who were the most vulnerable to sexual assault while traveling. Of all the women travelers that I discovered in my studies, Sarah Kemble Knight ended up being my favorite. And I'm going to include a link to her travel diary in the description box below. I'm also going to include a link to a blog post which goes into a little bit more detail on women traveling in British North America, and I'll link to a short creative that I put together just for fun. As always, thank you for getting nerdy with me, and I will see you in the next video.